Raymond Hamilton is one of the few people in history that actually escaped from the Texas death house in Huntsville, Texas. And in fact, the day he escaped from the death house, and this is after Bonnie and Clyde had been killed, the same day John Dillinger was killed in Chicago.
He says in Texas, he says some people say, that the death penalty is wrong. He said in Texas, if you kill somebody, we will kill you back. And he said, well, not only if you got 3 credible witnesses, we'll put you in the express lane. Your name is certainly synonymous with Texas coon hunters and nationally with the Dreamwalker breed and so many hats that you've worn down through the years. But how did that all start?
Describe the Texas State hunt. It was more like I always thought of it as a modern-day version or a Texas modern-day version of the old rendezvous that the mountain men back in the Jim Bridger, Kit Carson days. It was more like a happening. The more exclusive you try to be, the smaller you're going to be. The more inclusive you are, the bigger you're going to be.
Welcome to the Houndsman XP podcast. As always, we have our man from the South with us today and resident author and coonhound expert, Steve Fielder. How are you today, Steve?
Salutations, greetings, and all that good stuff. I'm doing good. As always, it's a good day to be alive. As the weatherman always says, it's sunny in Florida. So we have no shortage of sunshine. We have no shortage of humidity. We have no shortage of alligators, cottonmouths, armadillos, and tourists. So, and you can put those in the order of which you like the best or which you hate the most. But at any rate, that's Florida, and I'm in it, and I'm glad to be here.
Well, good deal. Well, I'll tell you what, we've been having some extremely dry weather for southeastern Indiana, and we're losing a lot of leaves already, so, and the temperatures are dropping, so it's starting to feel like fall, and I'm pretty wound up about that. And just returned from a bear hunt in Arizona, and that was an awesome experience, and we'll get into that some other time. But Steve, you went out and recruited an old friend of yours, and he's also an author, and I'm just going to hand this off to you and let you do the introduction of our guest today.
Well, it's my privilege to introduce this guy. In our little pre-show remarks, he made reference to me being the elder of the two of us. So I kind of like the way you said my old friend there. This fella and I go back to my UKC days. And when I was, for lack of a better term, in charge of the field operations department there, it was my privilege to hire some really great guys to serve as field reps. And at that time, the World Championship was building very rapidly, and we needed representation all around the country. And we were talking earlier, and we're not sure whether he was already aboard when I came to UKC in January of 1983. But if not, he came along soon after. And it's just fantastic for me to introduce our guest today, Sid Underwood from Texas. How you doing this morning, Sid?
Well, I'm doing fine. How are y'all doing?
We're doing great.
We're great. We're great. We're doing what we do, and that's just, kind of running our mouths here this morning. But no, you're a guy that I've wanted to lasso for this podcast since the very beginning. And our times down through the years, Sid, have been really good times for me. I've always enjoyed being in your company, and you're a man of few words on email and texting, but we're hoping to coax more words out of you today. And I know that you have lots of words, because I went back and reread your book here, and there's 200 and some pages on them. And like old Bubba back in West Virginia, they were talking about, his education. And he says, well, I know what's in every book in every library in the world. And they said, oh, yeah, you got to be kidding. He said, no, so words. So we're going to try to get some words out of you today, my friend. Hey, you know what? Let's just, as a means of introduction here for you, let's talk about who Sid Underwood is first, and talk a little bit about where you were born, where you grew up, where you're living now. Just get that out of the way. Sid, you want to start that off for us?
Yeah, I'll give you a capsule of who Sid Underwood is and was. I was born in Fort Worth, and then was actually reared, or was a native of Florence Hill, which is an unincorporated farming community in southwest Dallas County. If you looked at a map of the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex and located Grand Prairie, which is one of the what we call mid-cities between Dallas and Fort Worth. Well, I grew up about 8 miles south of Grand Prairie, where I grew up now is, like so much down in the Metroplex area, is part of Grand Prairie now. But when I grew up, it was a little rural community with cotton fields and creeks, and in fact, one creek notably was Fish Creek, which I guess we'll get into later. But in any event, that's where I grew up, and then actually went to school there. My first 3 years, little rural community school, Florence Hill. My mother was a school teacher. She started teaching in the late 50s in Arlington, Texas, and so actually some strings were pulled, and from the fourth grade on, including through University of Texas at Arlington, I went to school. All my school days were in Arlington. So as far as getting me to young adulthood, that's the story.
I see. Now, Arlington is where the baseball stadium is, right?
Well, more importantly to me, it's where the football stadium is. But you're correct. The Ranger Stadium, of course, is there, but AT&T Stadium, the Cowboy Stadium, is, of course, adjacent to it. And in fact, for those who follow sports, there is a new Globe Life field being built there, literally right in that same area. It's going to be a kind of a domed or semi-domed stadium for baseball. And so, anyway, yeah, it's all right there in Central Arlington.
Well, I thought we were going to get through this podcast without talking about the Cowboys or mention them, but I see that we've done that already, and we've opened that door. I have to tell my funny little story. Back in the days before UKC, I was at a meeting at some kind of a trade show or whatever in Dallas, and we went to a football game. And this was in the older stadium, I believe. This would be pre-1983. So has there been a stadium built since that time?
No, well, the Cowboys, of course, started off in the old Cotton Bowl right there in, Fair Park and near downtown Dallas. And they were there till 70, 71 time frame. And then that's when they went to Texas Stadium, the one with the famous hole in the roof stadium.
That's where I went. Yeah. And the little funny story, and then we can move along, is that they were playing the Rams, I believe, and Tony Dorsett was playing at that time. And after having a couple of beverages, I needed to go to the men's room. And I got up and went to the men's room, and while I was gone, Tony Dorsett ripped off about a 90-yard run, which I missed because we didn't have instant replay on the Jumbotron back in those days. But at any rate, that's my experience with the.
Well, that's interesting, and to hark back to those days, if the offense was on the field and Tony Dorsett was in the backfield, that was never be a good time to go to the restroom.
That's right. Okay, well, you alluded to the fact, well, maybe I'm jumping ahead here, but you alluded to the fact that this was an area, a rural area at that time with cotton fields and creeks and stuff. Is that you grew up out there? Did you start hunting when you were a youngster in that environment?
Yes, and when I was in single digits, I'd already started hunting. I mean, I remember killing my first dove when I was 9 years old with my grandfather's old single shot 20 gauge shotgun. So yeah, I had been, in answer to your question, I had begun hunting just kid. We'd go out with our 22s or shotguns and hunt any and everything in the daytime. And then, as time went on, for whatever reason, I had some little cur dogs that would run about anything. And I personally just got interested in going out at night with a little 2-cell flashlight, and they'd tree possums and skunks and stuff like that. And so I guess it's kind of maybe that seed of being interested in hunting at night, just came naturally to me.
Yeah, well, I did jump ahead here in our outline, but I think living in the country, that's how most of it. Well, I actually lived on the edge of town, but it was right across the highway. I could consider it to be in a rural area. But let's go back here just a minute and talk about your vocation, your education, that sort of thing, where you went to school and then how you got involved with the job that you were in for many years.
Okay, well, like I said, I went to school through the University of Texas at Arlington and got my BA degree in English and minor in journalism. Anyway, I guess my main job after that, I'm not going to go through every job I've ever had, but the main job I first had was in the newspaper business, and I worked for 6 years for the Arlington Daily News, which was one of the suburban dailies in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And so then I had several other jobs, but in the mid-'80s, I had really, as a Metroplex, and forgive me if I interchange that with Dallas-Fort Worth, but if you don't know, the Metroplex and Dallas-Fort Worth is one and the same. But in any event, I got to where I could see the handwriting on the wall with the growth of that area. So I was trying to get out somewhere where I could still make a decent living, for my family and everything, but also just be more back out in the country like I was used to. So, in fact, I had a coon hunting friend, past coon hunting friend, and we hunted other stuff in our young days, named Bill Moore. And Bill had gone to work down at the Comanche Peak nuclear power plant site near Glenrose, Texas, southwest of the Metroplex. And so I on a whim, I called him one day, and he said, I think there's an opening in the community relations public information group down here. And so sure enough, I made a call to the person who was in charge of that, and one thing led to another. And so consequently, in 85, then I went on down to the Comanche Peak nuclear power plant. And then for the next 30 years, that was my calling there. And I did property management, emergency planning, public information, community relations, number of things, but it was a wonderful career. And like I say, it was a more rural area. And so I was able to have a lot of, great places to coon hunt and so on. So a wonderful experience for me.
Well, and then since that time, since you retired, you've kind of picked up another job, haven't you?
That's right. In my semi-retirement, I knew I wasn't going to sit, but I also knew I wanted flexibility in whatever I did. So consequently, I guess maybe it's in my DNA because my mother was a lifelong school teacher, other than when she worked during the war, World War II, as a Rosie the Riveter for a few years. But other than that, she was a school teacher. Anyway, I said, well, I'll try substitute teaching and see how I like that, because I like the flexibility. And yes or no, you don't have to, you can if you want to. And anyway, I found that I did enjoy it. I did like it. And so that in my semi-retirement, just to break the cabin fever and give me something to do when I want to. I've been substitute teaching.
Okay, is that at the high school level or elementary or college or what?
Initially, early on, I just basically did it from the littlest to the biggest, and then over time, I did graduate more towards junior high and high school, and now that I'm up here in Lamar County, I've really simplified. I really basically only do one district up here, the North Lamar district, and it's pretty much exclusively high school.
I see. Well, that's got to be a challenge in today's climate, I would think.
Well, and people say that, and it really is on the one hand, but on the other hand, when you get into it, for the most part, kids are still just kids. That the circumstances and the gizmos and things that they have now that we could have never even dreamed of course, that's all different. But really, when you boil it all down, they're still just kids.
Well, I live with a school teacher, so I understand somewhat of which you speak. Well, now I want to, of course, with the journalism background, that's something that I never had any formal training in writing, and I've done a lot of writing over the years, but my readers will probably recognize the fact that I don't have a degree in journalism. My son did get a degree in journalism at Eastern Michigan University and all, but somewhere in the 90s, and I don't know how far back we need to go with this, but you wrote a book that impressed me to no end. When I first saw it, I said, Sid, man, when did you have time to do all this research and put together this awesome book? And I want to set it up just a little bit, but I want you to talk about your book because I think it's very interesting to anybody. Certainly anyone that has talked about the Depression, Desperados, and so forth. And I want you to tell me what inspired you to write this book, Depression Desparado, the story or the Chronicle of Raymond Hamilton. I think Chris has a question that he wants to jump in here with, and then I want you to discuss this a little bit with us, okay?
Sure.
Let's let our guests go ahead and get into that. I've always been fascinated with that point in our history, and I want to hear what he has to say. That was a good question.
Well, okay. As I've mentioned before, I'm a native of southwestern Dallas County, and when I was growing up, of course, virtually everyone anyway, knows the Bonnie and Clyde story, the two most famous of the West Dallas Desperados or outlaws. Well, when I was growing up, because of where I grew up, I kept hearing another name that my elders talked about when I was a kid growing up, Raymond Hamilton this, Raymond Hamilton that. Well, I came over time. The reason I found out they did was because Raymond Hamilton, who later in his career, if you want to call it that, was really the main confederate of Bonnie and Clyde, or Clyde for sure. He, in fact, part of his youth, he had some step relatives out in southwestern Dallas County. Really, as a crow flies, not over about 5 miles from where I grew up. And of course, this is way before my time, but nonetheless, that proximity, and I had elders who had known about that. In fact, some of them, even after the Desperado days got going, they even saw Raymond Hamilton a few times running up and down those roads. You've got to remember it's a different era, and the communications weren't then what they are today, and that sort of thing. So it was more or less just, we knew that was him, but nobody had a phone or anything, and so he would be gone by the time you could tell anybody, pretty much. Nonetheless, that's how it got started, just in my mind. I said, well, Bonnie and Clyde's story's been told over and over, and I keep hearing this other story. So long story short, I got interested and got to looking into it. And at that time, his older brother, who was another one of the West Dallas Desperados, Floyd Hamilton, was still living. And so I got in contact with Floyd, and he was kind of reticent initially to talk, but eventually I got him, kind of befriended him enough that I was able to interview him and talk to him and get some details, and of course talk to many other people, to say the least, in the course of this. But so that's kind of how it all got started. And long story short, I started in '79 with the research, and I was in a workaday world, of course, during all that time with the family and so on, and other activities, to say the least, too. But over time, I did enough research and got enough put together, and finally found a publisher that was interested. And so in '95, it was in August of '95, so I guess this is kind of an anniversary time frame. But in any event, that's how it all came about as far as me getting the book researched, written, and published.
Well, Sid, I want you to give us just a synopsis of the book, of the life of this character. It was very interesting. I read it when I first saw the book, and is it still available? Can our listeners get the book if they want to pick it up?
They can. The book is now, I think you probably can go, whether new or used, maybe go on Amazon or some of those other search places. But having said that, the actual, the publishing house that has it now is called Wild Horse Media. And Wild Horse Media is, of course, you can go and type in Wild Horse Media, and they're out of Fort Worth. And it's available through Wild Horse Media.
Okay, without getting into a lot of details, because we've got a lot of coonhound area to cover today, unless Chris has something else, I'd like you to give us just a brief synopsis of the book, what readers are going to find when they buy this book.
Okay, well, it's kind of a cradle-to-grave story, a biography of Raymond Hamilton, and he was born up in southeastern Oklahoma, and then the family gravitated eventually to West Dallas, which was a rough, unincorporated part of the city back in those days. You got to remember, in those days, Dallas then was about the size of Waco, Texas now. It's a city of probably 100,000 at most. But in any event, so he got into that West Dallas scene, and of course got into eventually with the likes of Clyde, Barrow, and some of them. He was a little younger than Barrow, but nonetheless, he got into a crime, and then they just got into, one thing led to another, and they just got into some of the most sensational criminal episodes in the Southwest, certainly in the Texas area. And so this went on for a course of about 4 or 5 years. In fact, Raymond Hamilton's one of the few people in history that actually escaped from the Texas death house in Huntsville, Texas. And in fact, the day he escaped from the death house, and this is after Bonnie and Clyde had been killed, the same day John Dillinger was killed in Chicago. And so there's a front page of the New York Times that talks about the Dillinger being killed in Chicago, and Raymond Hamilton and some Confederates escaping the Texas death house the same day. And so
wow.
He kept going. Raymond kept going about a year after that. He was subsequently finally captured again in Fort Worth. And he'd already been sentenced to hundreds of years in prison, and also, but was under the death penalty. And then when they finally captured him the second time, the readers might enjoy this story with these people on death row now, who it takes years and years and years for their execution to occur. Raymond Hamilton was executed 35 days after he was captured the final time in Fort Worth. He was only 21 years old, kind of like Billy the Kid type thing, in kind of a modern era. So that's the synopsis.
That reminds me of a comedy routine by Ron White. If you know who Ron White is.
I know exactly the routine you're talking about.
He says in Texas, some people say, that the death penalty is wrong. He said in Texas, if you kill somebody, we will kill you back. And he said, well, not only if you got 3 credible witnesses, we'll put you in the express lane.
That is a good story, and of course, it's compared to those old days, it's still a little convoluted now. But Ron White, he is a funny guy. Of course, I'm parochial, and he's Texan.
Right. Well, as I have driven up, I think it's Interstate 45 there from Houston toward Dallas, and you got many years going to coon hunts at Fairfield and at Madisonville and places like that. You go by the Huntsville prison there, I think. Is it visible from the highway there?
Yeah, I think if you know where you're looking, you can see part of it. It's the old timers, they called it the walls back in the day, but for the obvious reason, the walls around it.
And that's what it was. Sparky was the name of that electric chair, wasn't it?
Old Sparky was the name of the electric chair, and that Raymond Hamilton and others got to visit one time back in the day.
All right, Chris, you got anything before we leave the book? But This thing is really interesting, and I would highly recommend it to anybody who would like a really good read about some incredibly bad and crazy youth gone wrong. But it's very well done, Sid, and the research is obviously amazing, and I'd recommend it to anybody.
Well,
I appreciate that.
I do have a question and maybe a statement, too. We talk about Old Sparky. Part of Rising Sun history here in southeastern Indiana is that the Red Oak, which the original electric chair was built out of, was harvested right here in Ohio County. And we actually, one of our claims to fame is the invention of what is Old Sparky. So that's kind of an interesting tie between here.
Wow. I
don't know if the furniture company that invented that actually shipped one down to Texas, and that's what our Desperado died in or not, but that's kind of an interesting side note. But I've got a question. So when you started researching in 1979, Sid, was that just more of a something that piqued your interest, or did you always have the goal of finally writing a book while you were doing the research?
The goal of writing the book, my interest had already been piqued, like I said, from hearing the stories, because of Raymond spent part of his youth out near where I grew up. Like I say, obviously I wasn't around at the time, but that geographic proximity that was the genesis of all of it. But then, with my journalism background and just interest in writing and I'm just very interested in all kinds of history. So nonetheless, that's kind of it. But in '79 is when I decided, hey, you know what? I think I'm going to write a book about this guy, and so that's how it got started. And fortunately, there were still Floyd Hamilton I mentioned, but others who were still around who remembered a lot of things about those times, and obviously I had a whole wealth of historical written data to go on to.
Well, the amazing thing to me, Sid, was you kept all this kind of under the radar as far as the coonhound world was concerned, because all of a sudden this book appears, and I said, "What? Look at this!" And,
well, I'm kind of an under the radar kind of guy, in case you hadn't already figured that out.
Well, that's true, but there's a tremendous lot going on under that radar, and I hope we can get into most of it today. Chris, you ready to go into this Sid Underwood, the coon hunter?
Absolutely.
Well, Sid, you touched on it a little bit earlier on about your little cur dogs or your dogs that you were using there with your friends. But let's talk about how, your early involvement in coon hunting. It's something that you've been involved with for many years. Your name is certainly synonymous with Texas coon hunters and nationally with the Treeing Walker breed and so many hats that you've worn down through the years. But how did that all start?
It started in 1962, March of 1962 in Lampasas, Texas, down in central Texas. And I had a great uncle down there who we were celebrating his 75th birthday. And he had a small ranch out east of Lampasas, about a 400-acre ranch. And anyway, part of that weekend celebration was going to be a coon hunt, which I'd never been on. But a bunch of my cousins and I and other relatives from various places were there for this weekend celebration. And so part of that, as I said, was a coon hunt. There was a local coon hunter. I don't know his real given, his first name, but his nickname was Snooks, like Snooks, Gann, Gann was his last name. But Snooks Gann was a local coon hunter. He had two red-boned dogs, male red bones, Mike and Red. And so, we as kids, we'd all gun hunted all our lives. And we were very young, so I don't mean to make that sound like we'd been out at it forever. But anyway, we weren't sure about that, hunting with those dogs, those hounds. But nonetheless, we went out there, and there was coons all over the place around my uncle's barns and out in the woods as well. So that we got several coons and around the barn area, and then Mike and Red, we went out into the woods of the ranch itself and treed, 2 or 3 coons that night. And while all of us who like to hunt and stuff enjoyed it, clearly for me, you talk about an epiphany. I don't know how else to say it, but I couldn't even think about anything else. That was just, it just took me by storm. And so, so that was the start there in Lampasas. And then later that summer, as I said, I lived out in the country and we had a screened in front porch. But I didn't know anybody who coon hunted. And so I thought, well, this is a one-time deal. I'm just a kid. I don't, have any wherewithal to do anything about it. But out later that summer, I heard the unmistakable sound of hounds down on Fish Creek, which was about a half mile south of where I lived. In any event, I just begged my mother. I said, please drive me down there. So I maybe by chance I might be able to see who it is or whatever. And so we went. She did drive me down there. It's kind of funny in this day and age. You'd almost be scared to, but back then we didn't give it a thought. And so she drove me down to Fish Creek, where this guys, and we got down there and there was no Studebaker car pulled off the side of the ditch there. And sure enough, sometimes I believe things happen for a reason. I saw some lights coming back towards the vehicle from the creek, a couple of lights. And then sure enough, here in a few minutes, here come 2 guys and here's these hounds. Mainly black and tan, but there were a couple of grade walkers too. And they had obviously been coon hunting down there and coming out. And so, I introduced myself, and they were from Grand Prairie, in fact, right there, the closest city to where I lived. And Bill Smith was the older guy and Maurice Montgomery was the younger. And so I introduced myself, told them about, my hunting down there at my uncle's in Lampasas. And so they said, well, we'll give you a call. And so sure enough, first Mr. Smith called me. And then later, Maurice and I got to hunting. And so So that's the story for me really began that summer night down on Fish Creek when they came out of there with those McDonald Black and Tans and, like I say, a couple of grade walkers.
You know, it's amazing how many times, and I know Chris Powell's probably thinking about this as you're talking. We had Jerry Mall, the director of field operations for PKC, on the show not long ago, and he talked about a similar experience of hearing hounds treat on a creek near their farm and going to explore to see what happened. And I can look back at my dad. Experience was the same, of laying in bed upstairs in the old farmhouse and listen to a neighbor's dog trail up the creek. So it's amazing how that is a scenario that's played out probably hundreds and hundreds of times down through the years. But okay, you mentioned Mr. Smith and Mr. Montgomery there. Who were some of the early influences on your life as a houndsman, Sid?
Well, of course, initially they were, and in fact, it was strictly, and they were 99% strictly pleasure hunters. I mean, they hunted between the two of them. They probably didn't hunt in 5 competition events in their lifetime. But having said that, for a couple of years there, it was strictly pleasure hunting. And then in '64, I went to they decided they wanted to go to the famous Texas State Hunt, which in those days was held at Fort Parker State Park near Mahia, Texas. In any event, I was thrilled beyond words because my mother let me skip school on a Friday, which, you know, that was just a double win. You know, I was beside myself to go to this big hunt. But also to be able to miss school, I mean, that was how much better could it get? And so even though I didn't hunt in the state hunt, they hunted in it on that Friday night. And so that was actually one other small UKC hunt down at Goldston, Texas, north of Waco. Maurice and I had gone to that and seen a dog show during the daytime, even though we didn't hunt in the hunt. We just watched the dog show. So those two events in '64 were my first taste of any kind of competition type things. And there again, Mr. Smith and Maurice just weren't big into the organized end of it really. So that was just kind of a snapshot for me. But so after that is when I really, a year later in '65, in October of '65, my mother, as I said, taught school in Arlington. There was a 6th grade, she taught 6th grade, and a 6th grade girl in there named Judy Higgins, just one day out of the blue, told my mom, I guess, you know, just, I don't know what all they were talking about. She said, "My daddy's a coon hunter." And my mother kind of laughed and said, "Well, my son's a coon hunter." And so that's how I met James Higgins. And James, who was, you know, along with Mr. Smith and Maurice, I always considered him one of my 3 coon hunting godfathers. And when I got to meet James, he was already into the registered treeing walkers, and he worked for the railroad and was stationed in Arlington in those days. And so that's how James Higgins and I got started.
Well, Sid, you mentioned the Texas State Hunt, and I want to continue with this, your involvement with the sport, but I think our listeners would really find interesting an account or a description of the Texas State Hunt. You mentioned in the 60s, and of course it was not until 1983 in September, after going to the UKC in January of that year, that I attended my first Texas State Championship. And for anybody that's listening that attended one of those state championships during that era of the 80s or 90s, and I'm sure that you can take it back a lot farther than that, Sid, one of the most phenomenal events that I've ever attended, unique in many ways, and just tell our listeners a little bit about the Texas State Hunt, how it was conducted, the atmosphere there, and all. It's just a great piece of coon hunting history that I think our listeners would enjoy.
Well, and if you go back to the beginning, and this is before my time that involved with coon hunting anyway, the germination for the state hunt, the Texas State Hunt, really went back to the old mountain music type hunts that Eddie Ross, the famous Midwest promoter, put on, going back to the 50s. And so the early start of it was back then, and it just kept getting bigger and bigger. And in fact, outgrew Fort Parker State Park location, and that's when I believe 1969 is when it went to Fairfield. Just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and it's kind of interesting that you mentioned that 83, those early 80 time frame was when it was at its crescendo. I mean, it was in fact the largest UKC hunt, if not the largest hunt period in the United States. I mean, we're talking 300 plus dogs in both nights, you know. So it was a huge hunt, and a pretty big show too. But the hunt was what was really so big. But to describe the Texas State Hunt, it was more like I always thought of it as a modern day version, or a Texas modern day version of the old rendezvous that the mountain men back in the Jim Bridger, Kit Carson days. It was more like a happening than just a hunt. I mean, you had people, you had mule riders that coon hunted that would come in there. You had the old dog trader guys and gals, and then you had the more, if you want to call it that, more serious mainline type competition hunters. You had people coming from all over, even if they weren't going to hunt in the hunt, or even showing the show or whatever. They came there to visit, to buy, in some cases, supplies and so on. So and you know, there was a band and there was a dance and it was just a happening. You know, the best way I know to describe it was a happening. It was a big rendezvous. People marked their calendars. Back in the day, it was in October, the second Saturday in October, but over time, bow hunting kind of came into the fore, so they did move it to the second weekend in September for many, many years. But it was just unique, and I'm not saying there are not been other events through the years, and certainly any old timers listen to this and say, well, I kind of, you know, my state event back in the day may have been like that and so on. But the Texas State Hunt was a truly legendary event.
Well, as I remember, you know, my impression when I first went there is you walked around the grounds. It was at one central building that housed the kitchen, and that's usually, well, it was where I set up the UKC table to do business there, and it happened to be the only building on the grounds with air conditioning. But as I remember, the kitchen, you know, was on one side where you could walk up and order food. On the other end of that building was a stage, and there was a local prison band that played there, as I recall, in the early days, and the music was great and typical for Texas, and people were dancing that Texas two-step, and there was just such an atmosphere. And as you walked along the aisleways outside, these little, I want to call them lean-tos, but little roofed, open-sided structures were everywhere. Vendors were set up in those areas. There were areas where people camped under those shelters. There was always usually the older hunters playing 42 with dominoes, and that incessant droning of the PA system, you know, drawing the dogs, calling the dogs. And boy, I get a lump in my throat as I think about some of those hunters and those people that were such moving forces in that organization. down through the years that have gone on, Miss Billy Woodward and our good friend Dallas Sanders, and just on and on, the people that had such an impact down through the years. And it was just, to me, one of the most unique, enjoyable events that all year long. It came right on the heels of Autumn Oaks for me. It was sandwiched between Autumn Oaks and the UKC World Championship. But, man, I enjoyed going to Fairfield, Texas every year. It was just really a tremendous event.
Yeah, and I just it's hard to add to that, really, but that's true. I mean, it just like I say, you'd have to experience it to really to understand and get a feeling for it, because you did back in the day. In fact, there were some quote unquote name hunters and stuff who came to it from other parts of the country, but it was still primarily a Texas hunt. People came from all over the state, but it just there was a flavor, a feel that like none other that I've ever really been involved with. It was just like some of those. There were a lot of those old local hunters down in that part of the world, part of Texas, that they were legends in the area. I mean, they're people that at the national scene no one ever heard of, but because they never advertised or anything like that. But they, had some tremendous dogs and were, well known within the ranks of Texas coon hunting. But the Dallas Sanders, oh boy, the list goes on and on of those who were involved with it, like I say, for years in some cases, that really, I mean, you could, they were just almost a lifelong type dedication to it. And so, and I was on the board at one time myself back in the day. And so I have a great appreciation for all those who have been involved with it through the years.
Chris, you have anything?
Well, you were reading my mind. I was just typing you a message. As I talk to, I'm a few years younger than you are, Sid, and been involved in our state organization as well, and still talk to a lot of hunters here. But it seems like there's a trend nationwide, and our hunt numbers, the organized hunt, competition hunts, the numbers seem to be down. We've got an older generation of hunters who remember those great days. I don't know how many of those state Texas championship hunters or hounds you can name through the years, but probably the thing that you remember most is the atmosphere there. And our younger listeners hear this and they want to try to restore some of that. So what can you tell our listeners? What seed of hope, or how can they organize something like this? Is it worth redoing, in your opinion, or are those days gone by for us?
Well, I think number one, firstly, it certainly would be worth redoing, and I think that to speak of those, the times change in everything, and coon hunting is no different. So what Steve and I would consider the golden era. Somebody who's 20 years old now, they may have a different golden era 40 or 50 years from now. Mm-hmm. And it would just be somehow different. But in answer to your question, I think where maybe we've lost some of it is that and a part of it's just part of society. It's not just to do with coon hunting, but we've kind of lost that. As I saw the Texas State hunt through the years, like so many other things, it's not what it used to be. There's no two ways about it. But back then, it was kind of come one, come all. There were, no real restrictions on anything as far as, maybe you're not big into the competition part of it, but you're welcome. Come bring your dogs, talk, trade dogs, do whatever it is you like to do. And I'm afraid we've gotten a little in this modern era. We've gotten a little too we've gotten too just to the point. The only point being, hey, I show up 30 minutes before deadline, enter, hunt an hour, and go home type mentality. So I would say that if the youngsters were wanting to try to bring back that other stuff, you would have to kind of cultivate it and let people know, well, this isn't just a bunch of high dollar guys with hunting high dollar dogs for high dollar owners and so on and so forth. You kind of have to remember where this sport came from and how it all got started in the first place. And so I don't know that there's an easy answer, but I know that if I had to give one, just based on my observation of the germination of the state hunt through the years, is the more exclusive you try to be, the smaller you're going to be. The more inclusive you are, the bigger you're going to be.
And Sid, I think that's exactly what Chris and I are trying to accomplish with this podcast, is to bring all hound people of all persuasions under one roof, under one tent, and say, look, we're all in this thing together. And like you said there, no matter if you've got a little dog there, you didn't know, his daddy was old handy and his mama was old ready. And you've got a dog and you go coon hunting with him and he trees a possum now and then, well, good. Do you have fun? And to bring all of the people together with hounds so that we can not only present a unified front when legislative issues come up and so forth, but, man, that we can have a good time together. We can just get together and share stories and experiences and learn from each other and laugh at each other and laugh with each other. And that was the kind of thing I think that was happening there in Texas. I've still got a little plastic pencil that I got at the Texas State Hunt. And you might remember these, Sid. They gave them away to everybody. It was a little pencil, and it had a little cap on it, and it said something about this little pencil of mine or something. I don't know. It was, but
this little pencil of mine is going to make me a Texas State champion.
Hopefully you won't use that pencil in the wrong way. You'll only write down the account of the hunt as it happened.
Right.
But that's true. And wow. And I'm thinking as you're talking, you guys have sparked something here with me. Is maybe we ought to strive to have some kind of a rendezvous of hounds people on a national scale somewhere that would be somewhat convenient to everybody to attend. Come one, come all. Doesn't matter what you hunt. Doesn't matter what kind of dogs you hunt it with. Doesn't matter if you got a 7-generation pedigree or you don't have a clue. That you're welcome. You're a hounds person. And just, of course, I know I'm dreaming here, but that's how things get started. But, wouldn't that be an awesome, awesome thing?
Well, we get requests all the time. I get messages daily. You need to do one about squirrel hunting. You need to do one about hog hunting. You need to do one about rabbit hunting. And we try to juggle all that into our schedule here. But what you're talking about, Sid, is actually what we're trying to do. I don't care if you chase field mice with your hound. There is something here for you. And I think a lot of times where we're at now, your big game hunter or your pleasure hunter a lot of times doesn't feel like there is anything for them on the competition scene. And the competition scene says, well, I don't bear hunt, so that doesn't mean anything to me. When what we're talking about is a coming together, a rendezvous of all people that share the passion of chasing their preferred game with a hound. And that's the common thread here that I think we need to expose again and get right down to the fiber of this elaborate quilt that we've made out of hound sports. But the common fiber is the love of following the hound and understanding that Sid Underwood in Texas shares the same passion as Chris Powell in southeastern Indiana.
Yeah, and that is the type of thought process. I mean, I remember, back in the day that there were people who would come to that state hunt literally almost a week in advance, and so it was a rendezvous or a happening, and yeah, I think for sure if it was a way to engender that kind of thought process, because there's a lot of we all three of us certainly know this, and most people I think probably do. When you look at the coon dog magazines, or you look at any other official publication, or if you just follow certain aspects of the sport, we really forget that out there in the hinterlands, there are still people that we never heard of or never knew existed who still are involved with hounds and hunting and stuff. And they, you like I say, unless you live within a mile of them, you'll never know they were even around. And there's a lot of those folks who, they are strictly pleasure hunters or whatever, or they just dabble in it, but they still have an interest. And so if there was a way, and you would think in this modern era with the communication capabilities we have, there would be ways of reaching a lot of these folks that you could have something similar to what I think we're all alluding to.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. Well, let's talk about those Fish Creek hounds, Sid. I know that you mentioned earlier, and I got you off on the Texas State hunt, and that was a great trip down memory lane for me. What about your involvement with your buddy James Higgins, and when you started this Fish Creek Hounds breeding program or what have you?
Well, I first met James, after what I discussed, his daughter being in my mother's class in October of '65, and we went pleasure hunting one night, and then we just I don't know if either one of us were sure about how that was going to come out. But long story short, we really didn't get back together till the following April of 1966. To go hunting, and in fact, I remember the exact date. It was April 19th, because we did go pleasure hunting out at Springtown, Texas, northwest of Fort Worth, and had a great hunt, and so great. And by that time, I had started taking the American Cooner and Full Cry, so I decided, since I was one of the world's greatest writers, I would write the story about it. So I wrote this story called Coon Hunting Texas Style, and sure enough, the Cooner published it. And so I thought, I must be the Hemingway of the hound sport, but nonetheless, that's a quick how we got started. And James had the registered tree and walkers. His mentors had been pretty much W.F. Durden in Dallas and J.W. Swan in Jacksboro, and the common thread they had, Jacksboro's northwest of Fort Worth, about 80 miles. But the common thread that Mr. Durden and Mr. Swan had was that they had dogs from Shetler Sonny Boy bloodlines from Ohio, John Shetler, and Finley River bred dogs. And so James, hunting with them, he had hunted other breeds and stuff as a youth, but got started into not just registered treeing walkers, but treeing walkers of those bloodlines. And there was some Hirschberger blood mixed in there too, Dick Hirschberger, who was very well known back in the day. Anyway, so that's how we got started. And in the summer of '66, James and I had started the Fish Creek kennel name, and the dogs we registered and pups that we raised. We obviously put that name on them. So that's how the Fish Creek Hounds got started.
Well, there's some history back there of another famous dog over in Alabama that had a Fish Creek dog in its ancestry, but wasn't a walker dog.
That's true, and in fact, it really, if you look at the most famous national level, where the name Fish Creek, ironically enough, where the name Fish Creek is involved. I mean, and that's beyond. I mean, I put ads in the Tree and Walker handbook, that sort of thing. But James and I had a mutual friend in New Boston, Texas, which is in Northeast Texas, named Jimmy Woodard. And Jimmy had an outstanding single registered red tick English male, old buck, Woodard's buck. And then he had purchased from James a registered Tree and Walker female who was out of that bloodlines that we'd been hunting there for some years, and Red Bayou Jane was her name. Well, Jimmy decided he wanted to raise pups from Buck and Jane, so of course he had to single register Red Bayou Jane over as an English, even though she was a registered Tree and Walker, and he bred her, of course, to Buck. And I really don't know about all the progeny, but I do know about one, which ended up being Bashir's Blue Boy. His call name was Junior, and Bill Bashir's was down in what we call Deep East Texas, down in the Southeast Texas area, not too far out of Houston. And Bill Bashir's had him initially, and he getting a pretty big reputation. And then, of course, as you alluded to, ended up those dogs and ended up with, I believe it's R.F. Dickey over in Alabama is the one who really, really promoted them heavy. And so all those English dogs, and Bashir's Blue Boy was kind of a blue English, but a lot of, but that from that red tick sire, a lot of those, the dogs were red tick as well as some blue English out of there. Those dogs were in fact descended from, on one side anyway, from Fish Creek Tree and Walkers or Tree and Walker, Finley River type bred Tree and Walkers. And in fact, if you went back in history and looked at a lot of the photographs of the original, the ones really close up, a lot of them had the old telltale cornmeal color on their face, which was, just pretty much endemic to the, the Sonny Boy, Finley River type dog. So that's kind of how all that history got started. So, but if you get even in this day and age, probably if you got a big enough pedigree on a lot of the English dogs, you'd see Fish Creek in the background.
I got you. Well, what about some of the early hounds, or maybe names that our listeners would recognize that you hunted with there in Texas down through the years, Sid?
Well, probably the ones that they would recognize that I hunted with or had some involvement with, although I did not hunt with him when I was a field rep. I did a hunt down in Personville, Texas, where the famous House's Lipper was entered, and in fact won the hunt when Tom Hopkins had him. So I had a little involvement with him there, and then some of the other dogs that I either hunted with or was friends with. I of course known Delton Hall for years, and we had Yadkin Rattler fame. So I saw Rattler after he first bought him. He said, "I think I finally got the dog that I've always been looking for," just as another example. Now, I hunted with other breeds too as well. Now, I hunted with some of the McDonald Black and Tans. I've alluded back to when I first started. And so there was, they were out of John McDonald's old Night Rider dog. So there was some well-known black and tans, that I hunted with way back in the day. Some famous red bones that a lot of them are more famous in Texas than they were maybe on a national scale. Not a whole lot of the Texas people through the years, quite honestly, were ever real heavy into advertising these dogs. So I've been involved with a lot of dogs that would be named dogs down in here that people knew about, but not so much other places. Now, Mears Big Stride, which James and I had a mutual friend named Murphy Mears. Big Stride was a dog that the old Walker promoter Ralph Capehart advertised nationally for quite some time, and Stride had he was I believe out of some Alani Mears Finley River stuff, as I recall. So involved with some dogs that were named dogs, but mainly most of them that I hunted with were well known in this part of the world, but not so much on a national scale.
Well, I know when I went to Texas in 1969 in the Air Force there, and immediately met some coon hunters and began to go to the hunts and so forth. And in the conversations around the tables after the hunt and so forth, there were many names that came up during that time. And there were dogs such as Norman's Coon Stopper, Crow's Boss, the blue tick man Tom Broom there in Texas, I believe, or maybe he was Oklahoma. I don't remember for sure. Of course, John McDonald was very popular, and so there was that whole Texas culture of coon hunting that I found that was a bit foreign to me. I really didn't know these people, but I immediately saw that there was a very vibrant, thriving community of coon hunters in Texas back at that time.
There was.
Yeah.
I was just going to say Tom Broom was, in fact, from Gorman, Texas, which is out what we would call west central Texas, out in the peanut country, and he was well known in blue tick circles, back in the day. So that's just one example. Yeah.
Chris, you have anything? Well, let's talk about your work as a field rep.
I'm not sleeping. I just have my mic off. Yeah. No, I haven't got anything. Great. You're doing a great job, and I'm just enjoying the interview. So go ahead.
All right. Put that on my review, will you?
Sure.
Okay. Well, whether I hired you or you were there already, Sid, we had a great time during the years that you were a field rep for UKC. Do you have any thoughts, memories that you'd like to share about that time in your life?
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, as I've thought about it, you did in fact hire me. I mean, I had been either a judge, a show judge, or master of hounds prior to that. But you're correct. When you came on when I came on as field rep for 3 years, and it was just I have some memories. One thing was the snow stacked up 10 feet high at the Kalamazoo Airport. That would be one. But during the meetings, those meetings that we'd have, but the camaraderie that we had, or I had with the other field reps, and certainly with you and Fred, and just the whole experience, and it was a 3-year run as I recall, and I really just I enjoyed the whole aspect of it. Really, I don't know if it's enjoyable per se, but to do my part as far as making sure that the qualifying events and so on that I went to, were to the letter. You in all parts of the world, you'll sometimes encounter hunters that may have a reputation. And I was always, and I'm being kind here, but I'll just say that I was always out front of that because I knew most of them, at least a little bit. But even if I didn't, by the time I got through with my speech before they went to the woods, they knew how the cow ate the cabbage, so to speak. And so I knock on wood, I really didn't have almost no problems, I would say, during that era when, as far as the qualifying events. Well, for that matter, during some of the satellite stuff with the world hunts themselves. But yeah, the camaraderie with the fellow field reps from all over the country, just a very enjoyable time in my life, period, not just in coon hunting. So I'll always treasure it.
You know, as I look back over my years with the UKC, that's the thing that I think about most. You know, we tend to remember those things that we like the best, just like a favorite old hound or whatever. And it would be hard to try to describe to our listeners the kind of camaraderie we had. I think at one time for most of that time, there were 15 field reps working the country. We had several RQEs, many of which would draw 100 dogs or more back in those days. I remember having the Century Club for the field reps that entered more than 100 dogs, and we'd present those plaques at the World Hunt, and there would always be several of them. And but the times that we had rooming together around the entry tables, around dinner time, and we'd always try to get there a day or so early and have some type of an evening out with some entertainment and a nice meal together, and to see the families of the field reps, you know. And I look back and I could really get a big lump thinking about some of the dear people that I knew back in those days. And there's one couple that comes to mind to me every single time, and I know you'll remember them, Sid, was Paul and Francis Toon from Tennessee, the black and tan people. Do you remember them?
Yeah, I remember them very, very well. And they were, you know, gosh, it's hard to believe how time has flown, you know. My heavens, here I am 70 plus, and I guess back in those days I was still in my 30s, but you know, they were like they were grandparents for all of us.
Absolutely.
And they just they were the epitome of just down home Southern style. I mean, lady and gentleman. I mean, I don't know how else to say it.
Right, exactly. I think all of us who worked with the Toons will very fondly remember them and what sweet, incredible people they were. And I used to worry about them, you know, being out there in the dark of night at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, leaving a clubhouse with a bag full of money at all. But I think they were so revered and so respected that there had been a lot of club members that would have stepped up in their defense if anyone had tried to give them any problems. But there's just so many. Yeah, you know, I'd like to name them all. Jim Simpson comes to mind, and there are just so many down through the years. And I've got to get all that into writing, and maybe with a little paragraph about each one. But that was really the highlight of my entire career, with those times spent with the field reps at UKC.
Jim Simpson was certainly a legend right here and where I'm at. Jim was one of those guys that you could run into at a hunt. I've never met a more courteous and polite person in my life. And he started bringing his grandkids around about the time that I split the Central Indiana scene, but Jim was certainly a legend among hunters here in Central Indiana.
Well, I certainly don't want to toot my horn in any way, but you know, I always tried to pick the very cream of the crop of people in a given area. My buddy Nubbin Moore and I have traveled thousands of miles together over the last few years, and he was one of those people in Alabama, and on the list goes. But I think, Sid, you certainly fill the bill in that aspect as well. I want to talk to you about your involvement with the bench shows. You are considered one of most sought after bench show judges for major events in the country. How'd you get involved with that aspect, and do you have any stories for us?
Well, the way I got involved with it, I had started showing a little bit myself, and I would go to these shows, local type shows, and people in the background would be making comments about this or that, and I tried to stray from that as much as I could, but I got to thinking, you know what, I'm not going to be one of those who just sits back and critiques the judge or whatever. I'm going to jump into the fray myself. And so consequently, I had been showing dogs myself and watching shows for about 5 years. Anyway, in 1972, I believe it was, is when I got my license. And so, of course, I got started, and I hopefully I've done a good job through the years, or at least some people think so. And so, long story short, over time, I was able to judge this Texas State show and some others, and one thing led to another, and I'm not going to toot my horn either, but I guess with the exception of the Grand American, I think I've basically judged every major show there is, and most of them more than once. So I like to think that that's twofold, that people know I know what I'm talking about, and I'm fair. And so,
I think that goes without saying. What do you enjoy most about judging bench shows, Sid?
Well, the thing I most enjoy, particularly at the local level, is to help people who are maybe new to it or inexperienced or whatever, and to not get them discouraged, if they don't win on a particular day, to try to give them some pointers and stuff. Now then, I mentioned I've judged the on the total other 180-degree opposite of that, these big major shows. Everybody who walks around the corner knows pretty well is fast on the draw, and is going to have a real outstanding dog. And I've had people through the years, they say, "Man, isn't that pressure to judge all these, at these large shows, all these extremely nice-looking dogs?" I said I would rather judge a show like that than a 7 or 8 dog show with all mediocre dogs any day of the week, because number one, you're going to pick a good dog. Let's start there. People may not agree with your choice, but they probably won't disagree that you picked a good dog. So I'll start there. But yeah, just I'm just amazed too, the metamorphosis of that all through the years of where we've come with it as a sport. And I'm, I'm primarily a pleasure hunter, and I really always have been, but I do enjoy the competition aspects of the sport, and that includes being a show judge. And I certainly, I have many friends who are, some kind of exclusively and others kind of not so exclusively, who just show and stuff, but I've met many wonderful people through the years in that aspect as well. So there again, I hate to get back to the people thing all the time, but I know so many wonderful people all over the certainly eastern half of the United States that that I'd never have met if I hadn't done this.
For sure. Well, I wonder, looking at your activity as a historian, obviously in your book bears that out, but you've had a pretty intense interest in the history of the Walker breed. At one time, were you preparing to write a book about treeing Walker history, or was it, did I hear incorrectly on that?
I had kind of floated the idea of maybe doing a book, but then I really I just got sidetracked and decided not to. But having said that, I did do, and I have done articles on a number of the famous people in the tree and walker history, John Shetler, I've done stuff on John Monroe. I've done stuff, Dick Hirschberger, enjoyed doing that. Dwayne Clark, a lot of the pioneer types. I really enjoyed doing some articles in the Coon Dog magazines on them, and so Delton Hall down in Texas is another one. I mean, just different ones who've been in the walker business for years and years, and didn't the book idea kind of went by the wayside, but I still enjoyed the articles that I've done on people, well-known walker people.
Well, I know that I'm experiencing a little bit of pixelation or something here in our feed. I don't know if that's carrying through to our listeners. Hopefully not. But at any rate, I've noticed over the years, Sid, that you've been very faithful to send articles in to the coonhound publications when a member of the Texas coon hunting community has passed on, and I've always appreciated that very much. How did you begin that practice, and what's the history on that?
Well, part of it is my interest in history of all kinds and all levels, but really going back to my newspaper days, one of the at the Arlington Daily News, one of my certainly early assignments was to write the obituary column, and of course typically you would get some sort of write-up from the local funeral home or whatever, and then of course you would edit it for the purposes of the paper. So I guess I kind of had that history, but my real interest was, I've always thought, and it kind of goes back to what we were talking about, this rendezvous type idea and stuff. If I knew of someone, and that person, they may not be known more than a 10 square mile area around where they live as far as their fame or lack of in hunting, coon hunting or whatever, they still traipse down the creek like all the rest of us. And I always just believe anybody who was involved, deserved mention. And so certainly I've written about obscure people that no one had ever heard of to people certainly well known, certainly in Texas ranks for sure, and in many cases known even beyond that because of their involvement maybe in the organized end of things. But it's just a thing that means a lot to me. I just hate to see someone's life go by the wayside who's been involved in this sport, and not get some sort of mention, because some people have had a history of putting out full page ads for years on end. Others have never put an ad in a magazine or anywhere else. So we have the whole spectrum of people. But I just, and particularly those who I personally have known have been involved with local clubs and stuff, the backbone of the organized end of our sport. A lot of them sometimes they kind of go by the wayside because they're kind of localized or whatever. So I just think they deserve credit, and whenever I know about it, I'm gonna write them up.
Well, thanks to you for doing it, Sid, because I know it's appreciated very much, not only by the families and close friends of those people, but by everyone that sadly enough, we meet people through the obituaries that we immediately say, I wish I'd known that person. And so kudos to you for that.
Well,
sure.
I appreciate it. It's a labor of love, and as long as I can, I'm going to continue to do it.
Well, I have a quick question for you, and I know we're getting along in time here, and it's been a fantastic visit for me. As you and I, anytime we get together, we like to talk about the good days and the funny stories that happened along the way and so forth. But what's the thermometer on Texas coon hunting today, do you think? Do you still get out to a few of the hunts around, and are you running dogs? Are you still competing? Just what's the picture of coon hunting or hound hunting there in Texas today?
Well, it's still pretty vibrant. I mean, it's as far as the organized end of it, there's still a lot of interest now. And answer your question, yes, I still hunt, and yes, I still, and in fact, here just recently was fortunate enough to win a local PKC hunt here in Paris, and then just very recently too was fortunate enough to win a night champion cast hunt up in Atoka, Oklahoma, which is not too far from where I live. So yeah, I'm still interested in it. My salad days of competition hunting are long gone, but I'll tell you, I have to confess, I'm an old fuddy-duddy. On the one hand, when the shorter hunts started coming out, I wasn't sure about it, but now that I'm 70 plus, I like them better every day. and so
preach it.
I do still dabble in that, and I still pleasure hunt just regular as rain. I've partnered with Tom Froese up in Pawnee, Oklahoma, and he likes females and I like females. So between the two of us, we've got a kind of a stable full, and I'll typically keep one or two down here, and he has the rest up there. But so yeah, I'm very much still involved in it. As far as the thermometer on Texas hunting, it's like everywhere else. There's a lot of events, and probably too many, quite honestly. But I think that genie's escaped the bottle and probably not going back in. But having said that, there are a fair number of the younger set that I see around, which of course I think is a wonderful thing that are hunting in the various registries. And so it's not I'm not gonna pretend that it's like it was back in the day for more reasons than one, but there's still a fair amount of interest.
Well, that Texas State hunt now has been moved to the spring, has it not?
It was moved to the spring. It went from October to September, and now it's in the spring to kind of dodge, not being around the autumn oaks time frame, as well as in Texas. In early September in Texas, we're still typically blazing hot down here. So April, of course, another thing about our part of the world, you do roll the dice a little bit in April, because we can have some of the most beautiful weather you can imagine, and we can have some of the most dangerous weather on the face of the planet in April. So it's a little bit of a dice roll, but nonetheless, it was decided to opt for the cooler weather, and also to kind of, like I say, get away from some of the other major stuff that's going on. So yes, it is in April now. It did move back to Fairfield, which I'm very pleased with. It's just kind of the natural place for it to be, in my opinion. And that's no dispersion, I might add, against Madisonville area, which was a fantastic and is fantastic coon hunting area. But the grounds there were just kind of Spartan and kind of didn't have a lot of character to them.
Right.
And it just didn't have in my opinion, the literal setting was not real appealing. And so please, Madisonville people, don't throw darts at me. It's a great place, great coon hunting, great city and county, but that location, in my opinion, just wasn't as good as Fairfield.
Well, I have to agree, having attended the events at both. And well, Chris, how did I do with this guest?
Probably right up there with Sid Underwood's ratings on Goodreads for Depression Desperados. He's got close to a 5-star rating, so it was outstanding. And I just kind of sat back and listened to two old friends catch up and share a lot of knowledge, and I really appreciate you taking time to talk to us today, Sid, and hope to get to meet you one day soon and share a hunt with you. And is just a very interesting and entertaining hour or so.
Well, I appreciate it so very much, and echo, I know what y'all would echo, that we love this sport, and so anything I can do, PR-wise or otherwise, I'm always glad to help.
Well, Sid, you've always been a great ambassador for the sport, not only there in Texas, but across the country. Extremely well respected in our coonhound community, and it's just been a great pleasure for me to have you on the podcast today. I think that our listeners will certainly agree with that. And I hope to get you back on sometime. You're my go-to guy anytime I need to delve back into tree and walker history and some of my writings, and especially Texas history. And I appreciate your friendship, first of all, and your willingness to bail me out at times, and you inspire me. I'm going to be looking at 73 come October. I got a new young dog. He's 14 months old now. I'm hoping by springtime that he's going to be where he needs to be, and I'm going to get out there and try to compete. I don't know if I can make very many of those 1 mile walks to these deep and lonely hounds, but I'm sure mine's not going to be that type. But
yeah. Well, I appreciate that, and I think this great sport it's one of the things certainly in our lives, if we're involved in it, that it does keep us keep on keeping on, which is, I think, good in many ways.
Absolutely. Well, Chris, I guess that wraps it up from my end.
Well, I just want to remind people, I've been, listening to this podcast, but I've also been searching the internet for places that people could find Sid Underwood's book, Depression Desperados. It's available on Amazon and several different outlets there. And I'd encourage people to take a look at that. And are you anywhere else on the social media scene, Sid, or are you?
Well, I probably am in answer to your question, but there again, the Wild Horse Media in Fort Worth, they do have copies as well, and so consequently, there's if they want a copy of the book, certainly they can get it. If they can't get it anywhere else, they can contact me. I do keep some copies, not a lot, but I do have some. So I certainly don't mind working with anybody who's interested.
Well, put me down for one. I'd love to read it.
Okay.
Yeah, that era of American history. I had a ton of questions. We could do a whole podcast just on the book, because I've just always been intrigued by that point in our history and things like that. So put me down for a copy. That'd be awesome.
All right, sounds good. You'll have to. I know you have my contact information, so you'll need to give me yours.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
After this is over.
You bet. Steve, that does it for me, buddy. Why don't you wrap it up here?
Okay, Sid, we have a custom here on this podcast. We usually find a track of some kind or another to get after as we fade into the sunset here. We've got an old dusty coon track. It's along the Concho River down there outside of San Angelo. And, man, I tell you what, we got a hound here named Bugler, I believe, that can take this track, but I'm not sure. But I'm betting on one of those old Fish Creek hounds can take it. But when we cut these dogs loose, there's one thing I want to remind you and Chris. You follow your hound, and I'll follow mine.